remain standing and sing together. He became sin. He became sin, who knew no sin, that we might become his righteousness. He humbled himself and he carried the cross. Love so amazing. Love so amazing. Jesus Messiah, name above all names, blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, oh, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, Lord of all. His body the bread, his blood the wine, broken and poured out, all for love. The whole earth trembled and the veil was torn. Love so amazing. His love so amazing. Yeah. Jesus Messiah, the name above all names. He's my blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, Lord of all. Our hope is in you. All our hope is in you. All our hope is in you. All the glory to you, God, the Light of the world. Sing Jesus Messiah, name above all names, blessed Redeemer, Emmanuel, the rescue for sinners, the ransom from heaven, Jesus Messiah, Lord of all. Jesus Messiah, Lord of all. Lord of Amen. And the great, he's our Messiah today. We're going to sing a song now, Glorious Day, but it's not the Glorious Day arrangement that you know, so just follow along with me. We're going to be singing it in the future, and I think it's a great song that you'll love to know. One day when heaven is filled with his praises, one day when sin was black as could be, Jesus came forth to be born of a virgin, dwelt among men, my example is he. thank you for participating with us in that song. And I'd like to read a Bible verse real quick. Brent, will you hold that for me? And we're going to sing, the next song is called The Stand. And, it talks about how we'll stand with arms high, and our hearts will be exalted to Him. And in Romans, Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against the ungodliness." And that's definitely the wrong verse. But that's pretty good. I probably could have kept reading it. It would have fit. I could have made it fit somehow. But, okay, here we go. Okay. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And as it is written, the just shall live by faith." And as we sing this song, The Stand, prepare your hearts for some time this week where you may have to stand for the gospel, where you may have to take a stand in work, in your family, in your friends, okay? So let's sing together, The Stand. Stood before creation, eternity in your hand. You spoke the life into motion, my soul now to stand. You stood before my failure, my soul now to stand. So what can I say? What can I do but offer this heart, oh God, completely to you? So I walk upon salvation, Sing that once more. Is yours. I'll stand with arms high and heart abandoned in awe of the one who gave it all. I'll stand, my soul, Lord, to you surrender. All I am is yours. So what can I say? Oh, and what can I do for you? But offer this heart, oh God, completely to you. Oh, what can I say? What can I do? Offer this heart, oh God, completely to you. So I'll stand with arms high and heart abandoned in awe of the one who gave it all. So I'll stand, my soul, Lord, to you surrender. All I am is yours. One more time. I'll stand with arms high and heart abandoned in awe of the one who gave it all. I'll stand, my soul, Lord, to you surrender. All I am is yours. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you. I'm thinking about jumping over there to that Wrath of God passage she was reading there. That's good. Martin Buber's well-known Jewish theologian. One of his favorite stories is of the rabbi in Jerusalem who, upon hearing the pronouncement that the Messiah had come, stood from his desk, walked to the window and opened it and stuck his head out, looked to the left, looked to the right, looked out across the horizon, and decreed that nothing had changed. And so he went back to his desk and continued writing. Well, that Jewish theologian is correct in that when the Messiah comes, things should be different. Things should change. When we recognize Jesus as Messiah, there is to be something transformational that takes place in those that would give their life to Him. It's a question of Messiahship. I want us to open our Bibles this morning to Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 20. And I want you to listen as I read verses 1 through 8. On one of the days while he was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders confronted him. And they spoke, saying to him, "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things, or who is the one who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered and said to them, "I will also ask you a question, and you tell me. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men?" They reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it comes from. And Jesus said to them, "Nor will I tell you by what authority I do these things." In reading that exchange between Jesus and those religious leaders, those scribes, it seems that the question would really be one of authority. That's what they've asked about. Who gives you the authority? By whose authority do you do these things? And it would seem to be the question of the sermon, the question of authority. But when you look at the counter question that Jesus asked, it emerges that the real question is one of Messiahship. It's a real question of who he is. It's a real question of his identity and his role in the redemptive purposes of God. Because once you've settled the issue in your mind and your heart of who Jesus is he really the Christ? Is he really the Messiah? Is he really the anointed one? Is he really, truly the Son of God? Once you've resolved that issue in your mind, the issue of authority or the question of authority really becomes irrelevant. If you recognize him as Messiah, if you call him Messiah, if you bestow upon him that recognition of who he is as Christ, as the anointed one, then by virtue of that office and that position, then he has authority over us. So it's more a question of Messiahship and not one of authority. That's what's veiled. That's what is hidden in the questions that Jesus has asked. That's why he has countered this question of authority asked by these religious leaders, the priests and the scribes. That's why he has countered with a question regarding the baptism of John the Baptist. Maybe we need a little background on that very issue. If you'll turn back to Luke chapter 3, we can see some background on John the Baptist. In Luke chapter 3, listen to verse 3. Let's just begin reading in verse 3. And John the Baptist, speaking of John the Baptist, Luke writes, "And he came into all the district around the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. As it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every ravine will be filled, and every mountain and hill will be brought low. The crooked will become straight, and the rough roads smooth. And all flesh will see the salvation of God." And jump ahead to verses 15 and 16. It says, "Now while the people were in a state of expectation, and all were wondering in their hearts about John as to whether he was the Christ, John answered and said to them all, 'As for me, I baptize you with water, but one is coming who is mightier than I. And I'm not fit to untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire.'" John recognizes his prophetic role. He understands his role as defined by the prophets before him, especially the prophet Isaiah that he has quoted in this particular passage of Scripture. He understands that his role is just a forerunner. He's one that pronounces that one greater than me is coming, this one whose sandal I am unworthy of even loosening. I'm just a voice in the wilderness preparing the way for the one who will come, the expected one. But John, like any of us, he had difficult times in his life. And a bit later after this event, John would find himself thrown in prison. In prison for calling out the governor, speaking the truth, pointing out his sins. And now as he sits in a prison, John the Baptist is beginning to have his own doubts. He's beginning to have his own uncertainties. John the Baptist, like perhaps the disciples of Jesus, they have their own certain expectations of what the Messiah would do and what the Messiah would be. They're thinking in terms of a Messiah who, when he comes, will establish Israel as a national power, as a political power. That the Messiah, when he comes, he will overthrow Roman oppression and he will reestablish the throne of David, and that Israel will be a political, economic, militaristic force to be reckoned with in the world. And so as John recognizes his role as one who has paved the way, now then he's sitting in prison and things aren't going the way he thought they would. John, like you and like me, he begins to have some questions and doubts about how God is working in the world. And so when you jump ahead to Luke's Gospel chapter 7, John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus because he has some questions. And when the men came to him, in verse 20, when they came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to ask you, are you the expected one? Are you the coming one, literally? Are you the coming one? Are you the expected one? Or do we look for someone else? Verse 22, he answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them." It was strategic. It was a strategic way that Jesus has answered this question for the disciples of John the Baptist when he said, "Go and report what you have seen and heard." Go report your observations, all the things that you have seen me do in my life, in my ministry. It would have been very simple, but it would have been inappropriate for John, and it probably would not have satisfied John if Jesus had just said, "Yes. Yes, I'm the expected one. I'm the coming one. Go tell him." That probably would not have satisfied John because there were so many false Christs in that day and time. Jesus wanted to point out scripturally, a scripture that he knew John would recognize, the things that he was doing as a Messiah, that a Messiah is supposed to do. Also, Jesus did not want to come right out in front of his own disciples at this point in their understanding of who he was. He did not want to come out right now and say, "Yes, I am the Messiah." Because his own disciples were not yet prepared to understand fully the role of the Messiah. They were still running off these old nationalistic tapes as well. This idea that the Messiah would be a political ruler. And so instead of feeding that, at this stage in his life and ministry, Jesus paints another portrait. And plus, it even helps protect John the Baptist somewhat from an insecure government. Because if he said, "I'm the Messiah, I'm the king, I'm the anointed one," the government would see him as an insurrectionist. And so Jesus painted another picture for John. You tell him what you have seen and heard. And when you describe for him what you have seen and heard in your own experience, he will recognize that I am fulfilling the prophetic role that is defined for me scripturally as the Messiah. Notice as that passage continues on, when the messengers of John had left, he began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who are splendidly clothed and live in luxury are found in royal palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' And I say to you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he," speaking of himself. When all the people and the tax collectors heard this, they acknowledged God's justice, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected God's purpose for themselves, not having been baptized by John. You see what Jesus is doing in his response? I love the question, the portrait that he paints with his questions. What did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing. Those who are splendidly clothed and live in luxury are found in royal palaces. Did you go here, John the Baptist, when you heard a prophet was among you? Did you go out expecting to see a Herodian type king, an earthly type king, a Roman type king? Is that really what you were looking for? No. You were looking for something more than an earthly king. In the heart of your soul, in the depths of your soul, you were wanting a king, you were wanting a prophet that transcended earthly kingdoms. And that's what you had in John. You, the people, the crowds that have followed John the Baptist, that have participated, have partook in his baptism of repentance, you're on the right track when it comes to understanding the redemptive purposes of God in the world. In fact, your understanding of John's role, the role of John the Baptist, your understanding of John the Baptist is really a barometer and indicates to me how well you really do understand the unfolding purposes of God. Don't miss what Jesus is doing here as he's talking about John the Baptist, as he affirms the life and ministry of John the Baptist as one who is a forerunner. What's he doing? He's affirming his role as the one of whom John was speaking. In his affirmation of John the Baptist, in his affirmation of the people, saying, you have rightly embraced John the Baptist as a prophet from God. You have rightly understood him as a voice in the wilderness, a forerunner of the one who will come after him. And by your recognizing John and you validating his ministry, you have validated my Messiahship. You have validated and you have pointed out your understanding of my role in who I am as the Christ, as the Messiah, the expected one. The question of Messiahship, it changes everything. It's catastrophic, it's transformational, it is disruptive. To truly understand Jesus as the Messiah, to decree that Jesus is Lord, that great first century declaration, Jesus is Lord, when we embrace that, when we live that, when we practice that, it puts us out of step with the rest of the world. And so it's a question that has to be begged this morning. This question of Messiahship, do you understand it? Have you embraced it? Because it's a question that changes things. Well, it changed things for these who would even pose the question. We see that the question of Messiahship, it really disrupts present kingdoms. The question of Messiahship, when you start to understand who Jesus is, his role as the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, that the redemptive purposes of God in time and history are hinged upon the life and the ministry of this man, well, it becomes very disruptive to present kingdoms. That's what these scribes, that's what these religious leaders were really concerned about, was preserving their own kingdom. In verse 2 of chapter 20, and they spoke, saying to him, and we see in previous verses, they're already trying to corner him, to trip him up. And they spoke, saying to him, tell us by what authority you are doing these things. Or who is the one who gave you this authority? Because in their mind, this issue of authority has to do with power. You see, they themselves, they want to preserve their power. They're concerned, they're concerned that their power is slipping away. They see the masses, they see the crowds, especially the youth movement that is being attracted to Jesus. And this religious establishment, they feel like they're losing control. They're seeing the end of institutional religion. They're seeing the end of this hierarchy that they control, where they have the authority, where they have the power. They see themselves losing their influence. Oh, the priests have their place. The priests who are in charge of the temple, the daily priests, there were thousands of priests, but these particular priests, they had oversight of temple business by virtue of their biological birth. They were born into this position of being priests. They were a part of the priestly tribe established by Moses. But these others, the scribes, the scribes had no footprint back at Sinai. They were not on some kind of divine calling. They had no divine mission. The scribes had their position by virtue of their knowledge and their wealth. In fact, they themselves were in bed with the Roman officials. The Roman officials really were the ones that appointed the governor of that region, himself appointed the high priest. And the high priest kept his very vestments in the Antonia fortress built by Herod the Great. And so you see this unholy alliance that existed between the religious establishment and the government being in bed together. So you see how much they had to lose. They felt their power, they felt their authority slipping through their fingers. Because Jesus, in his Messiahship, was disruptive to their kingdom. You and I, 2,000 years later, sit here and listen to a sermon about it, and we shake our heads and go, my goodness, I can't believe that the leadership of the community of faith got so far off track that they made their bed with the government. I can't believe that they established that kind of unholy alliance, and they were so blind to the things of God that they became so self-absorbed and so concerned about self-preservation and their own kingdom that they were blind to what the Messiah would desire to accomplish in their life. It's easy for us to do that. But the reality is we all have our own kingdoms, don't we? Don't we all build our life in a certain kind of frame, in a certain kind of structure that you wake up to, that you live in every day? That's a metaphor for our kingdom. We build and construct every day by our choices and decisions. We build a kingdom. Oh, and we may name Jesus as Lord, and we may recognize that he is the Messiah, but how far does that go? Because we don't want our kingdom to be disrupted. I've framed my life a certain way. But when I acknowledge him as Messiah, when we know that he is the Christ, when he is given that place in our heart, in our life, when that becomes the fabric of who we are, this calling of Jesus Christ in each of our lives, then is not the struggle from that day forward, but a dismantling of our kingdom? Bringing more and more of our kingdom, letting it go and giving it more and more over to his lordship? How much am I willing to let go? How much am I willing to give over this kingdom that I've built over to him so that he might truly be Lord? It's disruptive. No longer are we content with institutional religion as was practiced in that day and time. In fact, that leads to another issue that arises in this question of Messiahship. Not only does the question of Messiahship disrupt our present kingdoms, but we also discover that the question of Messiahship causes us to calculate. It causes us to calculate. That's what these scribes and lawyers, religious leaders are doing. Verse 5, it says they reasoned among themselves. Literally, they calculated. They reasoned among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why did you not believe him? But if we say that John's baptism is from men, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet. They reasoned, they calculated. How much is this going to cost us? See, most people, especially in Western culture and in American Christianity, most American professing Christians are more comfortable with a perfunctory kind of religion. A kind of religion that, if there's nothing else going on, that will take them to church on Sunday. It's a perfunctory kind of religion that because we've got up and gone to the trouble of going to church on Sunday, and we've stood when we were instructed to stand, we sat when we were instructed to sit, we bowed our head at the appropriate times, we said amen at the appropriate times, we listened and nodded in the sermon at the appropriate times. We like that kind of perfunctory religion where we can go home at the end of the service and we can feel good about having done that. That I have done my religious duty, I have done my religious token. That's what Jesus and his Messiahship came to disrupt. You see, that's why these religious leaders were so concerned. If you go back to, let's look back again at chapter 7. Verses 29 and 30, we know the response of the people. They have embraced John. Their barometer is on target to understanding the unfolding purposes of God. Verse 29, when all the people and the tax collectors heard this, they acknowledged God's justice. They acknowledged what God was doing, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers, they rejected God's purpose for themselves, not having been baptized by John. Do you see what their concern was? If John's baptism, if the baptism of John the Baptist, his baptism of repentance, if the people have embraced this notion that this is the path, the unfolding path of righteousness, if they believe that this is the path of righteousness and now Jesus is the continuation of that, then there is no need for the temple. There is no need for the temple. Do you see how monumental that is? Now then, we're going beyond this Messiahship thing. We're going beyond perfunctory religion. We're going beyond being at the temple at a certain time, at a certain hour, bringing a sacrifice in a certain way. Now then, it's no longer about ritualistic behavior that makes us feel good about ourselves. Now then, we're talking about life in the Spirit. Now then, we're talking about a personal relationship with this living God. And when you talk about a personal relationship, things get messy. Now then, it's a process of discovery. Now it's a process of journeying forward into this future that God has in store for me, in realizing the possibilities of what might be as I walk in faith. Now then, the temple is not necessary. You see why they were so anxious? The religious establishment was so anxious to crucify Jesus. They couldn't get him crucified fast enough because to the religious establishment, the life of Jesus and him coming as the Messiah, it was the end of pomposity and pretense. And the scary thing is that Jesus was crucified in a society that looks a great deal like ours. A corrupt church, timid politicians, a fickle proletariat led by professional agitators. They couldn't crucify him fast enough because he disrupted their kingdoms. He turned their life upside down and they became calculating. Well, we do the same thing. We calculate how much this lordship is going to cost us. We want eternal life, but I don't want to go nuts on this stuff, you know. I want to secure my eternal destiny, but you know, this lordship stuff, Bobby, I don't know if you've been in church life so long that you just don't realize this lordship stuff, it clashes out there in the real world. I mean, Bobby, what we meet up with every day in the real world, those standards and those principles are completely different from Christian principles and Christian standards. I just don't think you understand, but I think you're so out of touch, Bobby. You've probably been doing this preaching gig for so long, you're probably out of touch. You don't realize that this lordship thing, if you really practice it in the real world, listen, you can't win the case, you can't close the deal. It just doesn't get it done. No, I understand that. I know that. I've lived that world. That's why the lordship, the call of Christ in our life, the lordship of Jesus Christ in our life, if it's embraced, if it's the fabric of who we are, if it's the DNA, if it's what defines us as a person, then I realize I'm going to bump up against the standards and the principles of this world probably on a daily basis. But are you going to take a stand? Do you fear God more than you fear man? Do you value the opinion of God more than you value the opinion of man? 2 weeks ago, actually last week, I did the wedding ceremony of a young lady. This young lady was a very bright, intelligent young lady, very driven in her academic life. She graduated with a 4.0 from Baylor, not bad. A 4.0 at Baylor in her undergrad. She graduated number 2 in her class at Baylor Law. Number 2 in her class at Baylor Law. She was recruited by the most prestigious law firms across the country, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, California. The most prestigious law firms in the country were all bidding for her services. She practiced her craft for 5 years. And she quit last year. In speaking with her about that decision, and let me preface it by saying she was also a young lady who took her faith very seriously. In explaining her decision to me, she said, every day I felt like I was slipping further and further away from my principles and my ethical moorings. Now, I'm not indicting any vocation, any profession here. This isn't a shot at the legal profession. This is what this young lady was dealing with. But she said, I was dying every day. I felt I was slipping further and further away from my principles and my ethical moorings. I was spending 80 hours a week looking for precedences that would prove our case, but had no interest in the truth. Spending all of my time finding a precedent of cases that would make our point, that would win our case, but was not interested in the truth. And she said, I came to a point where I said, no more. My principles are more important than my practice. That's a rare voice in today's culture. My principles are more important than my practice. And that's why there's so much calculating. What's the trade-off? What's the give and take? That's what the Messiahship of Jesus does in our life. But there's a final thing we recognize in this exchange, and that is that the question of Messiahship, it demands an answer. You can't be indifferent. You can't be ambivalent. You can't say, well, I really don't have an opinion about that. We are not afforded that luxury. Now notice in verses 7 and 8, so they answered. This is after all they're calculating. So they answered that they did not know where it came from, this baptism of John. They answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, nor will I tell you by what authority I do these things. In other words, if you're going to ignore my Messiahship, if you refuse to see the evidence that is among you, that can be seen by anyone and everyone who has eyes to see, if you're not going to acknowledge my Messiahship, if you're not going to embrace it, then there's really no need in me answering your question. The issue of authority is really irrelevant if you don't recognize me as being the Messiah. You see, you and I, as the revelation of God is made known to us, the purposes of God, as these things are made known to us, that the purposes of God are fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. A lot of times, and especially if you grew up in church, I did not. But when you grow up in church, I'm convinced that for those who grew up in church, that whenever we talk about the gospel, the good news, Jesus dying on the cross for your sins, and the significance of that and the call of that upon our life and what that means for our life, I think if you grew up in church, you take that knowledge for granted. You think you understand it and know that just because you've heard it in church all your life. What's lost on us so often is that if we do understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of the redemptive purposes of God, that God so longed for a relationship with you that he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross for you, what is lost on us so often is that when we understand that is divine revelation. Who do people say that I am, Peter? Thou art the Christ, he said, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. It's not because you're so much smarter, Peter, than everybody else. It's not because you really have a keen grasp of spiritual things. My Father in heaven revealed this to you. If you understand that Jesus died on the cross for you, that you can have a life of meaning and purpose, don't miss the significance of this. This is the Spirit of the living God working and speaking in your heart. And when you know this, when you have a cognitive understanding of this, you are placed at a crossroads of responsibility. You're at a place of having to make a decision, a determination of what your life is going to be about in relationship to this one Jesus who is the Messiah. And it requires an answer. You can't say, well, I really don't have an opinion. No, you have an opinion. You can't say, well, I'm just going to put it off. I understand I need to do that, but I'm going to put it off. There is no guarantee of tomorrow. Today is the day of salvation. But you are literally at a crossroads, and you have to choose. It's found throughout Scripture. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And the evidence is right there before you of who Jesus is as the Messiah. That's the very thing he's saying back in chapter 3 in verse 6. In the prophecies, and all flesh will see the salvation of God. It's going to be evident that the Messiah has come after John the Baptist, that he is among you. That's what Jesus said to the disciples of John the Baptist. Go tell him. Go tell him what you're seeing. Go tell him what you're hearing. And you and I have the benefit these 2,000 years later of reading about the things, the very things that they saw and heard that validate that he is the Messiah, that he is one with authority. He had authority over the temple, one greater than the temple, Jesus said. One greater than the temple is with you, is here now. Means you don't need the temple anymore. Righteousness of God, the righteousness of God is now fulfilled in me. It grows out of a personal relationship with me. It's not the ritual of the temple. Come to me. One greater than the temple. He has authority over the temple. One greater than the temple is here among you now. He had authority over the Scriptures. He taught the Bible like his Bible, the Old Testament, like no one else. The people were amazed. They were astonished. What manner of man is this? He teaches like one with authority, not like the scribes and the Pharisees. He had authority over the demons. He had authority over the principalities of the air. He had authority over illness. He had authority over disease. He had authority over blindness, lameness, paralysis. He even had authority over death. Lazarus, come forth. He had authority over nature. Peace, be still. And the storm stopped. It's there for every eye to see, to give affirmation that he is the Messiah, that authority, all authority, rests in him. But the real question is, does he have authority over you? Let's pray together. Father, We cannot turn away from the evidence. We cannot turn away from the testimony of Scripture that gives evidence that you are the Messiah. You are the fulfillment of Scripture. The lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised. And Father, as we acknowledge that you are the Messiah, then the implication is that you have authority and reign over our lives. Father, as we come to this time of invitation this morning, I pray that perhaps, Lord, this might be a significant time for someone within the sound of my voice. Someone who is standing at that very crossroad I described just a moment ago. A crossroad of understanding, a crossroad of responsibility. At a crossroad of making a decision, of coming forth and saying, yes, today I embrace Jesus as Lord, Master, and Savior. Or a choice to walk away. Lord, challenge us, give us strength, give us courage to make the decisions that need to be made. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.